From the White House in Washington on June 6, 1961, President Kennedy spoke to the American people.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. I returned this morning from a week-long trip to Europe, and I want to report to you on that trip in full. It was, in every sense, an unforgettable experience.
The presidential plane landed at Orly Airport in Paris. President Charles de Gaulle greeted the American chief executive. Mr. Kennedy described the purpose of his journey to Europe in these words. Two aims of American foreign policy above all others were the reason for the trip. The unity of the free world, whose strength is the security of us all, and the eventual achievement of a lasting peace. President Kennedy described the conversations he held with the French leader during his three-day stay in Paris. My talks with General de Gaulle were profoundly encouraging to me. Certain differences in our attitude on one or another problem became insignificant in view of our common commitment to defend freedom. Madame de Gaulle, Mrs. Kennedy, French government leaders, and heads of diplomatic missions gathered in the reception room of the airport. The U.S. Ambassador to France, James Gavin, introduced the members of the welcoming party to the American president. There was a special greeting for the president's sister-in-law. Mr. Kennedy was officially welcomed to France by President de Gaulle.
Monsieur le Président, à votre arrivée sur cette terre française,
Mr. President, upon your arrival on French land, which never saw Americans but as friends and allies, it is with great joy that I address to you and to the United States the most cordial greetings of France.
très cordial salut de la France.
President Kennedy replied,
I want to express on behalf of my wife and myself our most generous appreciation of your welcome today. I come from America, the daughter of Europe, to France, which is America's oldest friend.
Escorted by the Garde Républicaine, the two presidents drove into the heart of Paris. It was a ceremonial prelude to hours of earnest consultation between the two leaders. Mr. Kennedy described the nature of these talks.
I found General de Gaulle far more interested in our frankly stating our position, whether or not it was his own, than in appearing to agree with him when we do not.
About his meetings with President de Gaulle, Mr. Kennedy went on to say, in our agreement on defending Berlin, on working to improve the defenses of Europe, on aiding the economic and political independence of the underdeveloped world, including Latin America, on spurring European economic unity, on concluding successfully the conference at Laos, and on closer consultations and solidarity in the Western Alliance, General de Gaulle could not have been more cordial. The press noted the cordiality of the meetings between the first families of France and the United States. Visitors from all over the world succumbed to the classic beauty and the perennial charm of Paris. Saluted by the historic Garde Républicaine, Mr. Kennedy, with Secretary of State Dean Rusk, went to the Palais de Chaillot, escorted by Robert Saint-Jean, president of the Diplomatic Press Association. Mr. Kennedy came to address a luncheon of 400 newsmen. To them, he spoke of the problems we face to secure a lasting peace.
We must, in short, be constantly strengthening all of our forces, of all kinds, at all levels, deterring war and keeping the peace, by making certain that those who would oppose us know that we are determined to resist aggression whatever its force, and whatever kind of force is needed to resist it. The cause of freedom is under pressure all over the world, but because of the extraordinary rebirth of Western European strength, the struggle has been switched to other areas. The time has now come for us to associate more closely together than ever in the past in a massive and concerted attack on poverty, injustice, and oppression which overshadow so much of the globe.
In the stately rooms of the Quai d'Orsay, adorned with tapestries that are among the artistic treasures of France, President Kennedy, with Ambassador Gavin at his side, was host at a diplomatic reception. Many guests were from nations that have become independent in recent years. Stressing our obligations to one another in the fight for freedom and economic progress, Mr. Kennedy said in one of his speeches in Paris, "We are not spectators today. We are all contributing. We are all involved. Wherever it is our responsibility to make a maximum contribution." At NATO headquarters, President Kennedy explained why he believes history is moving in the direction of democracy.
There is no doubt that in our time we will see different groups assume positions of responsibility within each state. Different groups assume power. But the whole experience of the last years has shown the desire of people to be free and independent, to maintain their national sovereignty and independence. And I believe that when our times come to be recorded, this will be noted as the outstanding fact. This serves us because that is our ambition. Even the experience of those countries behind the Iron Curtain in their own relations show a strong desire to be free and independent.
Paris in the spring of 1961, at the time of President Kennedy's visit, was as beautiful as ever. Reporting on the atmosphere he found in France, President Kennedy said, "The French people as a whole showed vitality and energy which were both impressive and gratifying. Their recovery from the post-war period is dramatic." President Kennedy had this evidence of economic rebirth in mind when he said, "In many ways, the experience of Europe in the last 10 years has confounded all of those who believed that the tide of history was running against us." The city of Paris lived up to its reputation for tradition and pageantry in its civic reception for the American visitors. The ride to the Hôtel de Ville was one of the highlights of President Kennedy's 3-day stay in Paris. With Mrs. Kennedy, who proved immensely popular with all Parisians, the American chief executive came to City Hall to be greeted by the president of the Municipal Council, Mr. Julien Tardieu. Mr. Kennedy recalled that his 2 grandfathers had served on the city council of the city of Boston. He pointed out that in the everyday workings of democracy, it is the city council that is the closest to the people. After addressing the council, President and Mrs. Kennedy mingled with the Parisians who had gathered to express their welcome. Speaking of the people of Paris, in his report to the American nation, President Kennedy said, "They were heartwarming in their hospitality, and their graciousness to my wife is particularly appreciated." While her husband conferred with President de Gaulle, Mrs. Kennedy, escorted by Madame de Gaulle, visited a child care center and some of the historic landmarks and art museums of Paris. And so, after 3 days, the visit to Paris came to an end. French Prime Minister Michel Debré and Foreign Minister Maurice Couve de Morville bade President and Mrs. Kennedy farewell. The next stop was to be Vienna, capital of Austria. Summing up his feeling of satisfaction at the meetings he had had in Paris, President Kennedy said, "I left Paris for Vienna with increased confidence in Western unity and strength."